Welcome to the second topic of Module 1, Crime Scenes. We will begin to define physical evidence as it relates to crime scenes. Part of this is understanding the responsibilities of the first responding officer at a crime scene and the necessary steps to document a crime scene. The proper techniques for conducting a physical search for evidence at a crime scene, and also the proper techniques for documenting, collecting, and packaging the physical evidence will be discussed. Finally, we will discuss and understand the terminology chain of custody. A crime scene is a location where a crime has actually taken place and the area where the physical evidence will be retrieved by the law enforcement personnel. Without a crime scene, nothing would happen further in a forensic laboratory, since this is where all of the physical evidence comes from. If an investigator cannot recognize physical evidence or cannot properly preserve it for laboratory examination, no amount of sophisticated laboratory instrumentation or technical expertise can salvage that situation. So investigators must recognize and properly preserve evidence for that laboratory examination. This all begins with the first responding officer at a crime scene. That first responding officer must do a quick evaluation of the scene, then render aid if necessary, and finally secure that scene. So when we talk about the quick evaluation of the scene itself, they want to proceed with caution and assess the overall scene area. So they're going to scan the entire area to determine whether or not there are any secondary scenes that might also be involved. Are there people or vehicles in the area that might also need to be searched? They're going to make initial observations also to determine that scene safety. And in the process of doing this, it's going to be necessary in some instances to control any dangerous situations or persons. So essentially, they're going to be assessing the overall scene to determine the safety of the scene, but also the conditions of the scene so they can determine how much area will actually need to be examined. They need to look initially, determining whether doors are open or if they're locked. Are there lights on or off? Is there a lot of activity that had been going on? And while they're doing all of this initial quick evaluation, it's very important not to touch anything. Of course, if they're in the initial quick assessment of the scene, if they do find someone that needs first aid, that should be the priority at that point, to call paramedics or emergency personnel if necessary, and to render aid to those individuals. It's also necessary to secure the scene itself. So you want to establish a perimeter so that you can secure that area. Usually, if it's an indoor scene, it's going to include the central area and then any attached areas that might possibly also contain evidence. So if, for instance, if it's a room, it's going to also encompass the windows and the doors of that room itself. If it's an outside scene, an ample area should be included so that potential paths could also be examined. You initially want to lock or secure that area so that there's going to only be one point of entry or exit. This will help in limiting the number of personnel that will have availability to that crime scene. You also want to make sure that you're going to maintain a logbook of all the personnel that are either entering or exiting the area. Usually with the interior crime scenes, this is very easy to do because there's usually physical boundaries. For instance, walls, if it's an interior home crime scene, and a lot of times there are doorways so that it is very easy to secure and limit that point of entry to one area. On an external crime scene, it's going to be a little bit harder, but usually you want to make sure that there is going to be a limited area so that press and observers can be kept outside of that crime scene area. And this is necessary because that crime scene must be preserved so that the scene itself can be viewed and investigated so that any evidence that's there can actually be processed and collected from the crime scene. Depending on the severity of the crime, there might be more than one officer that would be responding to the crime itself. So the initial first responding officer usually then will work with the other officers to determine who's going to be the lead investigator. So they're going to decide who's going to be allowed to perform which roles at that crime scene itself. Once the scene has been secured, usually it involves separating and securing any potential witnesses that might be there at the crime scene, and then also identifying and collecting evidence. So sometimes these tasks might be divided between two individuals, one person in charge of the witnesses and one officer in charge of the collection of the physical evidence. However, in some instances, they might also call in other individuals to assist in the various duties at a crime scene. You have to be very careful, though, in how many people you allow in the crime scene, because there is the potential that everyone entering the scene could potentially destroy or contaminate evidence. So if you divide the duties there at the crime scene, initially it's going to be securing witnesses and doing witness interrogations, and then also processing and collecting the potential evidence from the scene itself. The witnesses should be separated so that they won't discuss the facts or events before the officers have an opportunity to obtain information from them. The individual that's in charge of recovering any potential evidence at the crime scene may have been the officer that did the quick evaluation of the crime scene initially. So he may already know where some of the potential evidence is, or if it isn't a different individual, they may have already found out from that quick assessment initially at the crime scene. But now they're going to go and take a little bit more time to evaluate the crime scene and hopefully place markers at some of the evidence until it can be collected and packaged appropriately. The markers will help other personnel to know that there is something there to hopefully prevent any loss and contamination of that evidence. Once the scene has been secured and the duties have been divided so that witnesses can be investigated, and then the evidence can be searched and processed, documentation is also a very important step in the crime scene itself also. And this documentation can involve taking notes, it can involve taking photographs or videos, and usually it also involves taking or making a sketch. The documentation of a crime scene is going to be a very consuming task at the scene itself, but it is necessary to fully document the crime scenes with notes that are usually taken in ink, and then usually also photographs and videos are also used to accurately capture the images there at the crime scene. This also helps in recording a lot of the fragile evidence at a crime scene. The notes should begin with the initial contact. So if there was a 911 call, that would be the beginning of the notes for the crime scene itself. It would help document who actually made the call in, the date and time that the call was made, any details that were given, and then at that time it would also be noted the officer that responded to that crime scene, when they arrived, who was actually present at the crime scene, and then hopefully they would have begun taking a log of any additional persons that were entering or exiting that crime scene. Evidence notes are also going to be a portion of the documentation of the crime scene. And when evidence is collected, there should be several things that are included in the notes concerning the evidence. The specific location where the evidence was collected from, if there is any particular condition that actually needs to be noted, if an item is wet or if an item is burned, you would want to include this in your notes. Obviously, the date and time of the collection, and then at times it's very important to also note what type of collection method was used. So if it is that the fibers were collected using tweezers, if they were collected using a taping method or a vacuum method, a lot of times this will also be included in the notes of the crime scene. But then additionally, the type of package that the evidence is put in, specifically how it's sealed, and any labeling that's also on the package would be included in the notes for the evidence itself. A lot of times photographs are taken of the scene. This does accurately portray the scene itself. Usually when photographs or videos are taken of a scene, they're going to be taken from various different angles to give a complete overview of the scene itself. So specifically, entry points, exit points, all different rooms, the adjacent rooms, you want to portray that entire crime scene itself. When evidence is collected, usually there's going to be a photograph taken before the collection so that it can also accurately depict where that location of the evidence came from. In many instances, the evidence will also be photographed with a ruler. Most photographs will also be taken in conjunction with some type of a log. So this is going to more accurately document the photographs. It might give information specifically about the photos themselves, where some of them may show the overall scene itself. You might also want to take a systematic approach to the photographs being taken so that you can have an overall photo of a room itself, then more of a mid-range focusing on a specific area in that room, and then the close-up of that evidence item itself. So these are examples of what might be considered your long-range orientation. In some instances, it might actually be an aerial photograph that shows a large area that might be the crime scene itself. But then it might also be a vehicle for a mid-range, and then items that are within that vehicle itself for your close range picture. Usually when you're doing photographs, you're going to try to take photographs from several different angles. So if it is an interior location, it's very easy to photograph an object from different angles if you remember to take it from the 4 different corners of a room. You always want to have that photo log so that you know exactly when the photos were taken, in what order, and what that photo is actually depicting. This is going to help with the admissibility of the photos when it comes time for prosecution. It helps give that accurate representation of that crime scene itself. In many instances, in addition to photographs, there will also be videos taken from the crime scene. In most instances, the videos will be done without audio. Most all crime scenes will also have some type of sketch documentation. And this helps relate the actual layout of the scene in relation to all the other items at the scene itself. Even with photographs, if you're trying to photograph a room, it's hard to get everything in that room documented from a single photograph. So a sketch of the room itself will help put things in relation to other items that are also contained in that same room, where a photograph may take 3 or 4 photographs to actually show that room itself. The crime scene sketch may be comprised of a single room, or it can be a larger area depending on the crime scene itself. To do a sketch, you want to have the overall dimensions of the scene. You want to know the orientation of the crime scene itself. So usually on a rough sketch, there's going to be an area where the designation of north is going to be shown. And then finally, you're going to locate all the various objects within that room or scene that you're trying to develop the crime scene sketch for. So it might be initially creating 4 walls, orienting which wall is the north wall, and then locating various chairs, various tables, lamps in that room itself. You always want to, with your objects, create the dimensions of the objects. So you'll be doing a lot of measuring of the objects themselves, and then the orientations into the room itself. At times, just to keep a sketch slightly simpler, a legend may actually be used to assist in this. So instead of labeling every table and every chair with table and chair, it may only have a single letter on it, and then that letter designating in the legend exactly what that item is. A lot of rough sketches may be taken back to an agency where a computer-aided drafting program could also be performed for that sketch itself. When documenting the scene and the evidence, remember there is a lot of information that you need to include. If there has already been a case number that is assigned to the crime scene, you would want to have this on your documentation, the date, time, and location, any weather or lighting conditions, the name of the sketch if it's a particular room in a building, and obviously the dimensions and the layout, any measurements and positioning, if you need to include that key or legend, the orientation, and then depending on if it is a rough sketch or a computer generated sketch, the overall scale of the sketch itself. There are several different techniques that can be used when you're creating crime scene sketches. There's the triangulation method, the baseline method, and the polar coordinate method. All of these have very good ways to orient that crime scene sketch depending on which one is easier for the scene itself. With your triangulation method, you typically use straight lines from two fixed points that you measure from. With the rectangular coordinates, you usually develop right angles to take your measurements from, and with a baseline, there's a fixed straight line that you actually measure from to your points that you're wanting to identify. So if we look at this example, let's say that the blue area is actually a room. And if we're looking at that triangulation method and you want to document the diamond shape that's in the blue room itself, with the triangulation method, remember you're going to take your measurements from two fixed points. So you would be taking measurements from that upper left and right corners, which are the fixed points for that diamond. Likewise, if you're taking the measurements for the star area, your measurements would be taken from the upper and the lower left corners. If we look at the rectangular coordinate method, you're going to take your measurements at right angles to the item that you're wanting to locate measure the location for. So usually when you use the rectangular coordinate method, you're going to be restricted to more square or rectangular spaces. And finally, that fixed baseline method is where you actually can create a straight line. So usually this is going to have two parallel areas that you can create that fixed line, and then from that fixed line you're going to measure to the point. You have to obviously know the specific location of that fixed line. So you're going to have to measure and orient the fixed line, and then also measure from that fixed line to your items that you're wanting to identify the location. For anything that is collected from a crime scene, any physical evidence, it's also necessary to create a chain of custody for that piece of evidence. So usually this is begun by creating a chain of custody log. This log is the legal term that is going to refer to the ability to guarantee that integrity of that evidence itself. So that chain of custody log is going to show who touched that piece of evidence every step along the way, from the beginning of the crime scene all the way through the analysis and when it's presented in court. And the reason that the chain of custody has to be provided is because of the Federal Rule 901, which requires that samples be authenticated. So if we think of the chain of custody, it is going to begin with that initial sample collection, but it's going to go through several different steps, all of these which would require written documentation for the tracking. So once the sample has been collected, it might be stored until it's transferred to the laboratory. Then it might be stored again until the analysis is done on the evidence. And then a final report is generated, and then usually the evidence might be stored until it's retrieved by that agency. So initially, starting with that sample collection, it's important to document who actually did the collection of the sample itself. And this is going to be done by noting several different things. Obviously, the sample name. Usually, it's also going to be given a unique identifier. So if it's a hair that's collected from a crime scene, it might be Exhibit 1. The date that it's collected, who did the collection, and what time they did the collection, where it was actually collected from, if that hair was retrieved from a blanket. Then also the packaging details. So if that hair was put into a Ziploc bag that was taped shut and initialed. All of this might be done by that individual that collected it there at the crime scene. But then further documentation will occur to that chain of custody when that piece of evidence is brought to the agency to be stored until it's transferred to a laboratory. So, for instance, the officer that did the actual collection at the crime scene, he might be handing it over to a custodian there at the police department. So the date and time that that exchange occurs is going to be documented, who actually received it, and then once again the packaging so that they can identify that package. And then similar documentation will also occur when that evidence is transferred to the laboratory. So the analyst or the custodian that's actually receiving it at the laboratory would also document the date and time that they received it, who they received it from, and who is the individual that's receiving the evidence. It may be stored prior to the analysis. In a lot of instances, it is a custodian that receives the evidence at the laboratory. So then when it's given to the lab analyst to do the examination on the evidence, the date and times are also going to be recorded and the individuals that are involved in that transfer. During the analysis, there's also documentation that should occur for the chain of custody. And usually the documentation that's going to occur during the analysis would be contained in that lab analyst notes. But it's going to contain things such as when that actual examination begins, what they're going to do with the evidence itself, how it's going to be tested. Initially, how the item was actually packaged. Is it still sealed as how the officer that collected it has stated that it was packaged and sealed? But then that analyst will open it. They'll notate the day and time that they begin their analysis, and then the different methods that are used on the item itself. In a lot of instances, it's necessary for them to document specifically how much of the item is actually being used for the testing. But then they'll also note any markings on the packaging that they make so that they can identify the item later on in court also. Usually a final report is generated, and it may contain some of this information concerning the chain of custody. The analyst may return the item back to a custodian there at the laboratory, or it might be returned back to the agency. But all of this would also be included in that chain of custody documentation. So they would also be documenting when they received it, the date and time, who received it, and who released the evidence, and then specifically what evidence was released. In a lot of situations, the evidence itself will have a document on the packaging, very similar to this, where the chain of custody can more easily be tracked from individual to individual. But also in some situations, each individual that's involved in that chain of custody may be making their own notes. So there would be documentation through that complete collection and handling of the sample itself, through the collection, the storage, any transfers, any analysis, and any disposition of the evidence itself. Let's take a short break, and then we'll finish our discussion on crime scenes.